All right, thank you for joining us for the January Raleigh Astronomy Club virtual meeting. We've got a great speaker this evening. Before we get into that, however, I'd like to just make a few announcements. First of all, everybody, welcome. And if you'd like to, if you're new or just joining for the first time in a while, feel free to drop a hello comment in chat. We'd like to know that you're here. If when we get started with the meeting, if everyone could go on mute, that'll be great. We want to make sure that we're respectful of the speaker, and we'll learn a little bit more about how he wants to handle questions and answers. And do want to also just very quickly share with you just a couple upcoming events for the club. So we have got, obviously we are starting Astronomy Days. Actually, it has started. So it's ongoing. Check out the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences for the schedule of events. We had a sky watching session that was going to happen at Prairie Ridge that has been canceled. Hopefully that will be a kind of a virtual star party, maybe sometime in February. We'll know a little bit more then. On February 11th, we have a face-to-face meeting at the Moorhead Planetarium. And that will be to discuss the statewide star party. The 17th, we've got our imaging special interest group meeting. February, we'll have a Raleigh Astronomy Club observing session. We have tentatively planned a stargazing on the Willard rooftop in Raleigh. And then we will kind of get back into our cadence of meetings and so forth. So we've got those things listed here. Heads up, we have Staunton River Star Party coming up at the very end of March, overlapping into a little bit of April. And then we kick off with the statewide star party. That is, again, a phenomenal event. We already have a few locations already signed up for. And then lastly, we've got a sky watching session tentatively planned for May 15th. So those are the upcoming events. I would also like to just mention we do have some opening positions within the club. So if anyone is interested, we do have one key holder position open, and that's for our site near Big Woods. So if someone is interested, please either contact one of the officers, or you can put a comment in the chat. And we do have a club historian position that has yet to be filled if anyone's interested. So again, that's it for just the high-level club announcements. And now I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Tony Rice. He is a NASA JPL Solar System Ambassador, and you will also see quite a bit of his work on WRAL. Is it contributing editor or contributor? Is that the correct title?
I think it's science contributor. It really doesn't matter.
Okay. So Tony, I will just hand it over to you and have you tell us about what's been going on with the James Webb Space Telescope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the intro. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I will go ahead and put my RAL plug in right now before I forget about it. So if you enjoy these things, which by your mere presence here, I assume you do, about once a week, I put something up on the WRAL weather blog, and it is often spaceflight related. It is sometimes astronomy related, but do check that out from time to time. I'm pretty proud of what we've been able to do there. The goal there is to get people, to some of the same goals that this club has, and that's getting them thinking about the night sky a little bit more and getting people thinking about science in a positive way. So before I jump into Webb, I will mention one article that was just posted yesterday. You may have read some things about it. I went ahead and did a little bit of investigating on it, did a little bit of the math too, to make sure that what was being said was actually close to true. So the upper stage of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket that was launched back in 2015 has been calculated to hit the moon in March, actually March 4th. So the first place I read it was in a British tabloid, which always gives me pause. They're not generally the best at their reporting skills when it comes to all things astronomical. So looked into it a little bit further. I'm still not 100% sure on it. So if you go and read the article I wrote about it, you'll see that there's lots of mentions of he said and things like that. But feel confident enough to actually go to press with it based on who was involved in some of the observations and getting the ephemeris figured out so that we would be able to come up with an estimate of when it's going to happen. So it will not be visible. Did figure that out. The estimate is that it's going to hit the far side of the moon, so won't be visible from here on Earth. And even if it did hit the near side, the chances of it being visible telescopically are pretty slim. We're talking about something tractor trailer size. This is the upper stage, not even the booster. The booster, we're all familiar with SpaceX. The booster did return after flight. This is one of the very first boosters that they were testing some of the landing capabilities. So it quote unquote landed in the ocean. They had to wave off a test landing on the drone ship that they normally try to land those things on due to high sea waves at the time. So the reason that this is even in an orbit that would take it to the moon is in a highly elliptical orbit. So orbits, the shape of the orbit, how circular it is measured by its eccentricity. And it's a number between 0 and 1 is how you describe what those eccentricities are. 0 is perfectly circular. That's around the equator. We might be able to achieve a 0 eccentricity orbit. 1 is a straight line. That is by definition no longer a circle. So it falls somewhere in between there. To give you an idea of how elongated this is, it's a 0.89. So really highly elliptical. And it's going out very much far beyond the orbit of the moon. Moon continues marching around Earth. So eventually those things are going to come into contact with each other. So not a big deal, but actually kind of interesting too. The other question that's been asked about this is, will either of the assets that are currently orbiting the moon, either the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter or India's, I'm not going to try and pronounce it, orbiter that is also orbiting the moon and taking images and sending those back, will either one of those be able to view, or will they be in position to see the impact? I can speak to LRO because I was able to pull some of the ephemeris down and calculate that out. It's going to be several thousand miles away. It's going to be over on the near side when that occurs. We won't see it there. And actually, the field of view of any of those, in either of those orbiter missions, is so very small that it's going to take a while for it to wind around and even be able to see any evidence of this. So that's that. We can talk about that some if you like, but those are the kind of things that I like to grab a hold of and try and put a little more fact around it. Try to put a little more the right approach to how I would like to see these things reported, and a little less of, again, the way the British tabloids do it, but that's neither here nor there. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. And to answer your question, I'm happy for interruptions whenever. I can't really pay attention to the chat. So, Doug or whomever, if you want to interrupt and keep me honest, you'll see the flow. Interrupt whenever, but you'll see when I tend to take a breath, and remind me to take a breath if I forget to do it. So let's go ahead and share.
Yeah, we'll do that. And in case anyone isn't watching the chat, we went ahead and put a link to Tony's posts in the chat to WRL. So check that out.
Awesome. Thank you. And the one previous to that, that might have been Astronomy Days. Let's try to push it a little bit there. But the one, it might have been the Webb one.
Yeah, you had SpaceX upper stage to impact, then SpaceX Discover upper stage, James Webb, and then Astronomy Days.
Okay, so there's one previous to that one about the Webb telescope going into L2 orbit. We'll go into that a little bit here today, But if this kind of stuff intrigues you, go back and look at that one. So let's jump on into Webb. So I'm going to start with some of the basics. I know a lot of you are pretty familiar with this, but I've been around astronomy clubs, both RAC and Chaos and any of the other ones long enough to know that there's three people sitting in the audience right now. There are observers, there are imagers, and then there are rocket people. And there's a little bit of overlap between them. So I feel confident that I'm probably going to be preaching to the choir a little bit here. But there's going to be a couple of you that maybe haven't seen some of this or have only seen Webb in passing. So if this is all old hat to you, keep me honest, ask some probing questions, fill in some things that I may have missed, but know that your neighbor sitting next to you may be one of those imaging guys that is coming to understand that there's this cool telescope called James Webb. So let's jump into it. So the whole purpose of Webb, and one of the questions that I have seen a lot about Webb is, why the heck do we bother building it? What is it bringing to the table that the Hubble Space Telescope isn't able to provide? On my next slide, we'll get into the electromagnetic spectrum and where that all fits. But Webb is specifically designed, and every mission out there has a set of primary objectives. Its primary objectives are looking for the earliest galaxies, earliest stars, looking for that first light. Because it's going to be seeing in infrared, we're going to see things in a lot different ways than we've ever been able to see using the Hubble Space Telescope. It's going to be able to see through dust. If you've ever seen the Orion Nebula in infrared versus in visible light, it's just amazing how different it is. What you're actually seeing is through that nebula, through all that cloud and dust, and that star nursery, that where those baby stars are that'll be born eventually. You're looking through that behind it to see the stars behind it. So Webb is going to give us the ability to look through those sorts of things. And what's fun about talking about this, and I've given a couple of talks at Astronomy Days with the general public, is people have some knowledge of these things, but they tend to have knowledge of one of the examples of these things, and that becomes the world for them. This happens with SpaceX. And we've got some time. I've got some slides from a talk I gave today on picking the right rocket to launch a mission. And that talk was born specifically out of questions about why the heck did we launch on a European rocket to launch the James Webb Space Telescope? And I've got some numbers that will explain why that is. But with space telescopes, people don't realize how many space telescopes there are out there. For many folks, it starts and ends with Hubble. But if you look at this graphic right here, you see that Hubble is very focused on the visible spectrum. And there's so much else out there that we can learn from. Webb is going to be looking mostly in that low infrared spectrum, whereas you look at something like a Spitzer that is out there as well. It's looking even higher in that infrared band. So this isn't a replacement. Webb isn't a replacement for the Hubble Space Telescope. It is a follow-on mission. Also, we need to consider that Hubble's getting on in years. We just had the 25th anniversary of this mission not that long ago, and it's not going to last forever. It does not have fuel on board. It does not have any of those kind of consumables that would limit its mission. But all of the mechanisms that handle pointing it in the right direction so it can do the observations that it needs to do, those are all moving parts. They're reaction wheels, which are giant spinning discs that are run by electricity, coming from those solar panels. Solar panels have a finite lifespan as well. But the point is, there's moving parts in there, and it's gonna wear out eventually. So I guess Webb is a little bit of replacement in that regard, because it is expected to last for quite a while. And I should probably go ahead and get into that. So you've probably seen some news about the longevity of the James Webb Space Telescope. And it's amazing to hear the numbers get bigger and bigger and bigger. So when you talk to the mission team back a year or so ago, and you ask them, how long is this telescope going to last? The answer was 5 years. And maybe they started talking about, we hope that it lasts 10 years. the math behind that, what's going on there. I mentioned that every NASA mission, and most countries do it this way, has a primary mission. And that's a length of time that they have it fueled for. They have a set of objectives that they want to meet. And by the end of that time, they believe that they can meet those objectives, and they're going to have enough fuel to do that. You always put a little bit more fuel on board because the asset's out there. You've already launched it. It's already in position to continue to use it. All you need is enough fuel to keep it going, and enough money to fund the teams here on Earth that continue to run the mission. So we always put a little bit of extra fuel on board. Those are extended missions. Just about everything running out there right now is on some sort of an extended mission. Very, very successful way of doing things. So primary mission, 5 years, extended mission, 10 years. Those calculations were done for nominal. And if you've ever watched a launch before of any NASA mission, you've heard the word nominal used over and over and over. What nominal means, it sounds like normal, and it's pretty close to normal. Nominal means different things for different missions. It's a set of parameters. Right down the middle of that is, what we're aiming for. We want it to perform, and there's lots of different parameters we're talking about here, but there's a range of values that are still considered okay. The closer you are to the middle of that nominal range, the better you're doing. And when it comes to something like when we put something like the James Webb Telescope into orbit, closer we are to middle and nominal, the longer that lifespan can be. So launch Christmas morning, I got up, I'm watched at launch. I was up before my family. My kid's older now, so getting up at crack of dawn is long in my rearview mirror. And it goes off without a hitch. We start hearing some rumblings afterwards about how well that launch went. And this is a nail biter. And I'm going to go through all the different steps that it took to get where we are today. And you'll see how much of a nail biter this was. But that first nail biter was getting into orbit. But the closer we got to that optimal orbit, the longer the lifespan can be, because we had to get it to the Lagrange point 2. And that's that point of balance about 1 million miles from Earth. There's also Lagrange point 1, which is between the Earth and the Sun. This is on that other side. It's like a hilltop amongst the gravity wells that are created by a huge one by the Sun and a little bit smaller one by the Earth and a lot smaller one by the Moon. It's a hilltop there that is a really good place to place a spacecraft and not have to use a whole lot of fuel to keep it there. So Webb is in solar orbit. It's moving along with the Earth, in tandem with the Earth at that L2 point. I like the analogy of a hilltop because we can't just park it there. We just can't park it on top of that hilltop and expect it to stay there. So that's why we're in that orbit. So let me dig in a little bit to why we're bothering with infrared. And I touched on it a little bit before, but here's an example of just why it makes some sense. You see those clouds, you see that dust, nebular space around this particular object. And who's going to name this object for me? So I stick it in the chat. Oh, I see you're jumping to key it in. I call this the Thanos Nebula, if you're a Marvel fan. So I'll wait for somebody to jump in and tell me which one this is. But you can see here, you're seeing in that longer wavelength of light, you're able to see so much behind it. The other reason is redshift. That light from those early galaxies has been traveling a long, long time. And over time, the light tends to stretch. So even something that was back in the visible spectrum, or even further to the left of that, can stretch out and moves into the infrared spectrum. So the farther we are into infrared, the more of the available light that we're going to see. So I mentioned that there was quite a number of space telescopes out there, and this gives you a view of a couple of them, and they are all aligned on this electromagnetic spectrum about where they are in the electromagnetic spectrum. So they're all performing different jobs. That's the way to think of it. Hubble is really the only one that's so focused on the visible spectrum. We see more into infrared and microwave again to be able to see that redshifted light. And the ones that are back in ultraviolet are doing the job of, in a lot of cases, looking for exoplanets. They operate really well in that part of the spectrum. One of my favorites is Sophia, and our favorite astronomer at the museum has flown on this a couple of times. We took a perfectly good 747, cut a hole in it, and stuck a giant telescope out of it. But the nice thing about that is it allows us to get above about, I think the number is 92% of the water in the atmosphere. So that is nearly a space telescope, but it's a nice movable one that we can park wherever we want over the Earth. Not so much park, but get it in the right position. Really good for occultations. We've used that with Pluto occultations a couple of times because you got to be in the right place on Earth to see something like that. But again, we're working with a number of these ground-based observatories as well. These are all working together to provide as much coverage of the full spectrum as possible. So before I jump into Webb the Man, why don't I take a breath and see if there's any discussion or questions or comments about the spectrum, part of the spectrum it's looking at, or what the goals of Webb are.
So far, no questions coming in through chat, but just thinking about on the infrared side, you mentioned the stretching of the light. So can you touch on a little bit more exactly, why is it that in essence the stretched infrared light would be that much more important or beneficial to us?
So it's seeing the things that we can't see otherwise, as is, I couldn't put it any better than it's put in this image. But again, the stretched light is representative of not just the light that's in that part of the spectrum, but because of the distances and the times that this has been traveling, it's representative of light in the visible spectrum as well. So what is now infrared used to be violet in some cases, that very, very old light. So this gives us access to, even though it's focused on that infrared part of the spectrum, it's actually giving us access to old visible light as well, and perhaps others. We'll find out.
Yeah, and something that would have been beyond Hubble's, sensors.
Absolutely outside of what Hubble is capable of doing. And the position at L2 and being able to hang out there and focus, it'll be moving. And it's going to have about a 6-month-long orbit around that L2 point, but it's going to be able to hold on a particular position in the sky for a lot longer than Hubble did. Hubble's in low Earth orbit. A lot of people don't realize that. Hubble's only 200, 250 miles up. So it's constantly moving. And if you're looking at a particular place, you imagers can attest to this. You get the best images when you're able to keep that aperture open and looking at that spot in the sky for as long as possible. And sometimes you have to stack images and to do that. Well, that's what Hubble's doing all the time. It can only keep its aperture pointed at a particular point in the sky for a matter of seconds to minutes. So it's got to come around on the next orbit and look back at that spot and stack those things up over time. It's going to be a lot easier to do planning with Webb, I think, because we're going to not have to take that into account. We're not going to have to look at orbital passes and the planning charts for it look like this this stripe of with different investigators getting different chunks of time over many orbits. We don't have to do that so much with Webb.
Sorry, we got another question from Jordan.
Shoot.
Do you want to unmute yourself,
Yes.
Jordan? Yeah.
So I heard before the analogy of like L2 is a hilltop, and I always think of orbits like the circling the drain valley kind of thing. So how does an orbit at L2 work? Like what is the inward force keeping it around that point?
You gotta move. You gotta keep moving to stay at that point. Webb has thrusters, but its thrusters are only on the backside, what we call the hot side, facing the sun, facing Earth. There are no thrusters on the front side. So what Webb is going to be doing, I like your analogy of the bowl. So picture yourself in a bowl, and you want to keep right on that edge. You don't want to go over the edge. You don't want to sit on top of the edge. So you're always just a little bit shy of that edge. And gravity is working different there than it would on Earth. So what we're doing is we're circling perpendicular to the edge of that bowl as we go around the bowl. And that allows us to stay right on the edge of that bowl. The way it was described to me was, think of that, the bowl would be the Earth's gravity well. And we're always pushing up just before we reach out of that gravity well, but we're always running uphill a little bit. So when we left the bottom of that gravity well on Christmas Day, I forget off the top of my head what the speed was, but it was quite a bit more than it was last week, right before we went into L2. So we were slowing as we got to the top of that bowl. And what's going to happen over the next 5, 10, 20 years is those thrusters are going to be fired about 3 to 4 times a year. Again, fired back towards the center of that bowl, Earth, center of that well, to push it back up the hill just a little bit. The purpose of it, back to your question, the purpose of it staying in motion is if it doesn't stay in motion, it won't stay in that spot. It's not possible to park something at L2 or any of the Lagrange points or anywhere and have it just stay there. Things have got to stay in motion. So we have this very slow orbit that helps maintain that stability, and the periodic, they call it station keeping, where they put it back on that station. And quickly about that orbit, something I found fascinating about it, whenever I've heard descriptions of missions that are at one of these Lagrange points, I think of this tiny little orbit around this, minuscule little point in space. And not the way it works, particularly with this mission. Picture the moon's orbit. Now double it. Now turn it on its side, and now move it out 1 million miles. And that's what the orbit of the Webb telescope is going to look like for 2 reasons. It's incredibly stable, does not require a whole lot of fuel. Again, the less fuel you use, the longer that your mission can last. But the other reason is we got to keep that orbit very, very wide, because this is a solar powered mission. And if we were to have a tighter orbit, we would be eclipsed by the Earth, and the sun would not make it to the solar panels, and we'd have a big problem for a solar powered mission. So that keeps us always out of the Earth's shadow. Think about it in 3D space, and can continue the mission. Did I answer your question? I just ramble for 2 minutes.
No, that was good. I think I understand. So it seems like that although L2, might form a hill, like what you might say, like an opposite of a gravity well, if you're like right at it, that as you go out from it, it seems like a gravity well, and you're using that well to hold the orbit.
Yeah, just on the edge of that well, and that slow motion is what helped keep us there. Gotcha. You got to keep moving.
Yeah, Tony, your post the other day, I put a link into the chat if anyone wants to look at it. It's the 4th image in your chat that shows all the 5 Lagrange points going around. I think did a really good job illustrating kind of how you're on the lip between gravity wells, and that's what's keeping you there. Again, if you can just kind of ride that hill.
Yeah, let's look at that real quick. Hold on, I'll bring that up. I do have a couple of images there that might help. 1 second. Doink. Let's see if I can share 2 things. I don't know how that works. You'll have to forgive me. I am not a Zoom guy at all. Okay. So there's the graphic that shows. I'll make this bigger. Let's make this bigger. I apologize. I have a screen the size of a barn door. Something I got into once we started working from home for the last, I don't know, decade or however long it's been. So this gives you an idea. This is in 3 dimensions, and this is looking down at the North Pole. So you're seeing a more circular than it probably ought to be lunar orbit over on the left-hand side. And that's the diameter, 478,000 miles. And Webb was riding uphill and down beneath the lunar orbit, the plane of the lunar orbit, to start that slow orbit around L2. So L2 would be in the middle there, and then the other image I think you're talking about is here. There it is.
Yep.
So I think I stole this one from Wikipedia. It's hard to beat this one. I wish the labels weren't so big, but you can see L1 between the sun and moon, L2 out beyond. There's not a whole lot at L2. There's a few things. It's a great place to do observations of the solar system and the universe as a whole. L1 is a really good place for space weather. So that mission that I was talking about earlier, that the upper stage of the SpaceX rocket is going to be impacting the moon, that launched a mission to L1. It launched a mission called Discover, which is there to basically watch for solar wind and look for changes in the geomagnetic properties, or I'm sorry, the magnetic properties of the solar wind that might trigger geomagnetic storms. That's run by NOAA through the space weather forecasting system up in Boulder, Colorado. But these are really good places to set spacecraft, because you kind of park them there. You can idle the engines more or less and keep them going. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And looking back, any more questions on that?
Yeah, we had one other question. There's a question about what's the difference between what the Herschel Space Observatory and Webb are observing.
Good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I suspect Herschel has a completely different set of objectives that happen to be met in infrared. Okay. We can look that up. All right, so I'm going to jump on to the man, the myth, the legend, James Webb. North Carolinian, born in a little town southwest of Oxford. It's got a new name, but at the time of his birth, it was called Tally Ho.
Yeah. Sorry, Tony, I think you're still sharing the WRAL page.
Thank you. I told you I was a
not a worry.
So let's kick this back in. And we'll have to do this, but that's okay. All right, so there's Mr. Webb. Okay, so James Webb started his career working for the military, focusing on radars. And it became pretty apparent that he had some really good people skills and really did a wonderful job of organizing very smart people, very talented people, very technical people. And because of that, he moved on as director of NASA during a pretty important period of time. During the early 60s, when the human spaceflight program was just getting underway. So during the Mercury and the Gemini days, he was there during the early Apollo days. He left that position and somebody else took over shortly before the lunar landing, shortly before Apollo 11. But I don't think it's a stretch to say that we probably wouldn't have gotten to the moon when we did had it not been for his skills. So I mentioned that he was from Oxford. He went to UNC, where he got, I believe, an education degree. I forget off the top of my head, but he is a UNC alum. Worked at NASA through the 60s. And if you've ever been to the Museum of Life Science in Durham, some of his personal items are there. They were donated by family. And my favorite piece there is in the upper left-hand corner there. And that's the driver's license that was given to him by the company that created the lunar rovers. The the cool little go-karts that folded out of the side of the lunar module, and gave us the ability to cover a lot more ground on the moon. But he was given driver's license #1 for his work there. So he had a lot to do with the manned space flight program, or human space flight program. Why the heck would we stick his name on a telescope? It's a very important reason. Throughout that time, when anybody on the call that's old enough to remember the Apollo program, that it is all that anybody talked about. The focus was completely on human spaceflight. And here he is running NASA. He, as a part of all, especially the budget discussions, ensured that NASA's whole mission, including aeronautics, as well as unmanned missions, robotic missions, and general science, received the money that it needed to keep going. Without him, we might have moved that needle so far over to human spaceflight that we wouldn't have been able to continue a lot of that, the kind of things that are going to be found with the James Webb Space Telescope. So this is a bit to honor him. And it's important to note that this doesn't happen often. If you go and look at the list of NASA missions, you're going to see a lot of acronyms. You're going to see a lot of engineers and scientists that think they're more clever than they actually are with some of those names. They try to get cute with them. We don't name them after people very often. This is one. Another is the Parker Solar Probe, which I was down at Kennedy back several years ago when we launched that. I got to talk to Dr. Parker. He received that name. It doesn't happen for living people, even less. He received the honor of that name because he was so instrumental in what this mission was going to study, in that heliophysics. He had predicted some things before we really had the ability to really detect them. So this is a pretty big honor. So next slide. And I gave this presentation, parts of it, to a group of teenagers at the Moorhead Planetarium several weeks ago. So I pandered a little bit and threw in some images of the early astronauts there at Moorhead. But you can see Webb down there shaking hands with Kennedy. He was, like it says, NASA administrator from 61 to 68, pretty key time. So here's his picture from the UNC yearbook. Okay, yeah, he had a bachelor's degree in education. They went ahead and put him from Oxford. And I'm really proud of the other, he was also the Webb High School in Oxford received his name, but I'm really proud of that big picture right there. And it's got a bit of a story behind it. The people that you see there, you might recognize Kelvin, our favorite mascot from the North Carolina Science Festival. There is a historian from Oxford there. The mayor of Oxford is there. And the two people you see on the left-hand side holding Kelvin, those are James Webb's kids. And he came to this dedication. The story behind this sign here, I was invited to sit on some meetings back before, it was about 2 or 3 years before the Apollo 11 anniversary. And Diener was, NCDNR, was looking at some ways that they might be able to celebrate them. We ended up doing quite a few things at the Natural Sciences Museum, but the History Museum also got very involved with it. And they were thinking about some ways that they might be able to do some things at some of the state parks. So through chatting with some of the people there, I found out I was sitting next to the person who was in part responsible for those signs right there, for those historic signs. I said, not for nothing, but we got this telescope that's going to be launched here soon, I hope. Took a little bit longer than we planned. But did you know that it's named for a North Carolinian? And like, yeah, whatever. I said, and that North Carolinian was the head of NASA during these very important periods of time. And like, tell me more about this. So I can't say for sure that this is because I had that conversation there, but I hope it helped a little bit. And he absolutely deserved this. This marker was placed around the corner from the home that he owned in Oxford. And it is in front of an elementary school, which I think is just great because those kids walk in every day and they see that it's somebody from Oxford did all these great things, and hopefully that inspires them a little bit. But I had a chance to talk with the kids, and obviously not kids at that point. And Mr. Webb, James Webb, is of course long since left us, but they were just a little bit bewildered. It was just dad for them, hearing all these people coming out and so interested in what their father did. So that was kind of fun. So here's a little bit more. This is an animation. I don't know how well it comes across on Zoom, but there it is, showing a visualization of exactly where this is going on, and me moving my hands around is not nearly as good as this animation that came from the Goddard Space Flight Center, and it's pretty much to scale in those distances, and gives you an idea of what that perpendicular orbit looks like. And it's all about stability. It's all about keeping it in the right place. Move to the next one. So let's get into the particulars of how this thing was launched. Any questions before we jump into that? And I'll let this run in the meantime, because it's just pretty pictures. Okay, so go ahead.
One here. So it says, sorry if you explained this, but is the James Webb Space Telescope going to be looking in a certain direction, since it's trying to look back in time to the beginning? I couldn't understand its orbit relative to that.
Mm-hmm. So you see where it's positioned, and it'll always have its back to Earth, and it's got these massive sun shields that we're going to see in a moment that are there to block the solar energy and keep it cool. The infrared cameras need to operate particularly these need to operate in a very, very cold environment, sub 300 degrees below zero. So it's got to keep its back to the Earth to block that heat. But if you think about the way that orbit works and how it's going to be facing outwards, as it moves around the sun, it's going to have a complete view of the universe, if you will. So I don't have information on what those first targets are going to be. I know that one has been selected for calibration purposes, but the very last slide I have will explain what's going to happen from here on out, when we can expect to see those first images. Other questions?
No, we're good.
All right, so let's jump into this. So launch. Quick bit on the launch. We launched from French Guiana. We launched from very close to the equator, and that was for two reasons. One, that's where Ariane Space launches from, a European provider that provided that Ariane 5 rocket. NASA was, of course, a very big part of this. They were instrumental in building the telescope, but they're not the only ones. European Space Agency as a partner, as is the Canadian Space Agency. One of the major contributions to the European Space Agency was the ride to orbit, was this Ariane 5. They launched from French Guiana. There's some benefits to launching that close to the equator. You get some free energy. If you think about it, you think about your globe, and you draw that circle, where does that biggest circle live? It lives right at the equator. So therefore, you're going just a little bit faster there, and that's a little more free energy in the orbit. So it turns out it's a pretty good place to launch rockets from. That's why it makes
Tony,
a little more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, if I can interrupt. I think we had some issues with the animation.
Okay.
Perfect.
Let's see if this looks any better. Oh, wonderful. So the very first step that happened after the launch was solar panel deployment. This was another automated step. Everything from launch up, it's the computers that are handling everything. Most everything past solar panel deployment is going to be button presses. It's going to be the team is deciding when these things are going to happen after a lot of checks to make sure everything has gone the way we hope it's going to go, and there's nothing that we need to adjust to make sure that next step is successful. So this was super important to have the solar panels deployed after that launch, because it had been on battery power for several hours at this point. And once it was out on the launch pad, and it only had so many hours of battery power available to it. So that actually happened a little bit sooner than they expected. And there's a timeline here that's down to the second and even smaller than that. And it happened a little bit sooner, but it's because the spacecraft determined it was in the right orientation, it was in that right orbit, and it was ready to start drawing power on its own. That was the next thing that happened. And then after that, we had our first mid-course correction burn. So this is our opportunity to put the spacecraft in the right orbit to get us going towards L2. And we were talking about, running up that hill from the bottom of that gravity well. This points us in the right direction. So once we get there, we're going to be able to get into that proper L2 orbit. That happened right on schedule. We actually burned a little bit less than we thought we would. Again, that's saving fuel. Every time you save fuel, that allows you to elongate your mission just a little bit more. And if you look down on the lower part of the screen, you'll see that we've got a bit of a graphic there that's showing where it is relative to the Earth and the Moon. And then you got a timer up in the upper part of the screen that shows you, elapsed time in days, hours, minutes, and seconds. Because this took a full month to get where we are today. We just got into L2 orbit. I believe it was on Monday. My days are kind of running together at this point, so it's been very, very recently. But just minutes after launch, we were farther out with the Webb telescope than Hubble was. So here we're still inside the lunar orbit, but we're soon going to pass that. The next thing that happened was deploying the antenna. Let's see if I can get my, there we go. So this gives us the ability to really start talking back to Earth. And we were able to get some initial telemetry forth. And this is all going through the deep locations in Spain, in Goldstone, California, about halfway between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, and in Canberra, Australia. Those 3 points allow us to see the entire solar system all at once. This antenna is talking back through those large antenna on Earth. This allows us to send commands up to it, and it's going to be where all these pretty pictures we're hoping to see eventually, they're going to come back down through that. So that was important to go ahead and push that out and be able to start having those conversations with the spacecraft as soon as possible. And you can see down there, we're past the orbit of the Moon at that point. So the next thing that happened was, now it's time to really start unfolding this sucker. And skip the slide. So let me go back one. I apologize, my my Mac is throwing a fit right now. There. 1 second.
No worries. I think we might be able to, while you're doing that, I'll be able to help answer a question that Jordan posted into chat.
Please.
So there's must be a limited period of time that it can image in one area of space before movement of L2 around the sun prevents it from continuing to look at that area of space without becoming exposed to sunlight, ? And I think that's exactly correct. But it's definitely more so time than what you could do with Hubble or anything else.
Very much so. And you've touched on a key thing there that is part of all the mission planning, and that is the rules are absolutely unwavering. You cannot look at the sun. And that would be very bad for any telescope. It would destroy this one, 100%. What is doing this? Oh, it's Zoom. Of course it's Zoom. For you, you computer types, you Linux heads, my load average right now is 117. And 98% of the CPU is being used by Zoom. Fun, huh? We'll
Time for an upgrade.
we'll treadle through. Hey, dude, I'm trying. Silicon's hard to find right now.
Yeah, Zoom is CPU intensive, even with the multiple core and multiple threads. It's just all there is to it.
Yeah, and I'm really pushing it with some of these animations too, I bet. But anyway,
Yeah.
we move on. So let's try this. I may just go to plain old slides. We'll see. View, zoom, fit slide. Okay, we're gonna try that. We're gonna do a little kinder, gentler approach to sharing and see if that doesn't help my poor laptop. I mean, it's only 5 years old. What do you want? Okay, so palette deploy. Eventually, this telescope is going to be the size of a tennis court. And there are full-size mock-ups of this that have toured around the country, and it's really hard to wrap your head around how big this thing is until you've stood next to it. But it's got to be folded up like a transformer up in the top of that rocket inside the clamshell payload fairing. So the very first thing we got to do is start unfolding it. So these are called pallets, and the pallets hold the sun shield, have some covers over the sun shield to protect them, but they're there to provide some structure to be able to pull the sun shield out and tighten it up so that it provides not only the blocking of the light, but especially of the heat. And there's several layers there that provide some insulation. We need to provide some room in order to actually raise or make it possible for that sunshade to move out. So in order to do that, the tower assembly where that primary mirror is and the secondary mirror rises up a couple of meters and makes that room. And you start to see some of this material, and it looks pink. It is part fabric, it is part plastic. It is a really incredible material that has a ripstop property to it as well. So this thing's going to get pelted by micrometeoroids over time. And the last thing we want to have happen is something like that to start a rip and destroy the properties of the sun shield. So it's no longer protecting the telescope. So it has ripstop capabilities in it as well. So it's not going to rip. Over time it'll get some holes in it, but we think that's going to be okay. The next thing that happens is we deploy what is called the solar trim tab. And you may have seen some missions that are looking to use the solar wind as propulsion. Well, here we don't want to be propulsed by the solar wind. So the best way to describe this is it's like a rudder. It's like something that would be deployed on a boat to help control the motion of the water beneath it. So this allows us to prevent the solar winds from pushing us out of the way or out of our out of the orbit that we need to be in. So then the next thing that happens is we got to unlock the sunshades. Is it gonna work for me? There we go. So there's a couple of covers that are on top of these sunshades, and they're gonna roll off and they're gonna expose that sunshade so we can start stretching it out. And absolutely everything you see here is being triggered by people. They decide it's time to do these things. We're up to day 5 already. Some of these things happen overnight. Most of them trying to be a little kinder to the people who are involved in this. Some of them have to come into the office. This is being run from the Goddard Space Flight Center, as well as the Space Science Telescope Institute that also runs Hubble up in Baltimore. But we're able to do these during daylight hours now. So a little kinder and gentler to the engineers that are responsible for this. And the way all these automated things are happening, it varies by what it is. Some of them are motors. Some of them are motors that are electrically triggered and are pulling cables or things like that. But a lot of it is using stored energy. A lot of it is springs that are preloaded. A lot of it are bolts that are holding things down that have explosive charges in it. You put a current across those charges, and they explode and release that energy. And there's a lot of different ways that things can happen. All of the items, all of the the ways that these things are triggered have been around for years and years and years. A lot of them come from military jets. You know, some of the exploding bolts have been have been on military jets where the mount points are for things like missiles and things like that. The point is, they've been around for a long time. They're tried and true. We have some confidence in them that they're going to work. This was a nail biter. You know, what you've seen so far shows you just the complexity of getting this thing unfolded. And had any of these steps not worked, we probably would have been left with a close to useless telescope, but it all worked. Let's look at the next one. Let's actually deploy those sunshades. You'll start to see absolutely how big they are. Again, the purpose of these sunshades is to provide a way to block that heat and block that light from making it to the other side, the business end of the telescope, where that primary mirror is, and of course the secondary mirror, but more importantly, the equipment on the other side, those instruments on the other side that need to operate in that really, really cold environment. So right now, I'm actually going to bring up a quick, and I'll stick this in chat, or maybe Doug, if you Google "where is Webb" and stick that link in chat for me, everybody else can see this as well.
Yeah, sure.
You know the one I'm talking about. So NASA's learned over the years, the more of this kind of information you share, the better, but there's nothing like real-time information. So the link that Doug's going to put in there, I'm bringing up, I'm not going to bother sharing it because I'm not going to crash Zoom again, has real-time information coming back from Webb. The reason I'm bringing this up is I wanted to talk about the hot side and the cold side of that sunshade. So the hot side, the side that's facing the sun, there's a couple of sensors on there, and the average temperature off of those sensors is 125 degrees Fahrenheit. And that seems counterintuitive. I mean, space is supposed to be cold. Space is cold in the shade. And that's what this sunshade is doing. The opposite side of that, where all these instruments are, is running right now just above negative 350. So the sunshade's doing a pretty good job. Look at this link, check on it over the next week, couple of months. You're going to see that number continue to go down. It's still got residual heat from sitting on Earth for many, many years. A lot of that has been given off, has been radiated off. But part of the process from here on out is going to be continuing to cool this telescope down. Let's look back here. Okay, so we've deployed our sunshades, but you can see, you know, this looks like some tinfoil, looks like a couple of stacks of tinfoil, very, very close together. We need to tension that. We need to really get it stretched out so that it can do its job. And all of these are animations. Of course, we don't have cameras out there. Cameras wouldn't do a really good job of watching this because it's not very, I mean, that's the purpose of these shades. It's not, there's not a whole lot of light out there. And we're not going to add additional light. We're not going to add additional risk to the mission by putting additional cameras out there. I mean, think about what these cameras are made of. I mean, they're made of, housings are made of plastic, and they're not the sturdiest of materials. They're probably not going to do very well out in these extreme temperatures. So at this point, not only we stretched it out, but we've also pulled those layers out and put negative space in between those layers. So that's why it's so very hot on one side of that set of sunshades and so very cold on the other. That insulative property in between it, any heat that it hits it has a lot harder time of making it from one side to the other. Because again, this is the, we'll call it the near vacuum of space. So next one, this is when it really starts to get fun. It's time to deploy those secondary mirrors, or deploy that secondary mirror. And this is to get it locked in position and out of the way of those primary mirrors. You might have caught it at the beginning of that animation, but the face of that secondary mirror, which is huge, it's a lot bigger than, it's about as big as a person. The face of that mirror is also covered in that gold material. Gold was selected because it is one of the best materials for reflecting efficiently infrared light. And I did some math on it a while ago. The all of the gold on both the primary mirrors and the secondary mirrors, if you were to scrape it all off and compress it into a sphere, about the size of a golf ball is what it ends up being. So next, it's time to, there we go. Okay, it's time to deploy that primary mirror. Most of those 18 mirror segments, hexagonal mirror segments, were in place already, but the set of 3 on each side, they kind of call them the wings, were folded away, again, so it could fit in the top of top of the rocket. At this point, we're starting to breathe a little bit easier. Getting that secondary mirror locked in place was really the key to making this a usable telescope. Had these 2 things failed here, we might have been able to limp along as a mission. But obviously, we want the full telescope. We want the full primary mirror in place. Each one of those mirror segments has actuators behind it as well. So that's what's been going on since they went into L2, is moving each one of those actuators to make sure they're operating as they should. The stand-up, the validation portion of this mission is going to be spent moving those actuators and getting this telescope calibrated to where they want it. Something we've all done with our own telescopes. I'm sure you wish sometimes that you have ability to change your primary mirror. I know we wish we had the ability to change the primary mirror of the or the primary optics of the Hubble Space Telescope, because it was ground incorrectly. A whole topic we could go into later, but we don't have to worry about that with Webb because we got the ability to change those optics on the fly. And next, we're almost there, is orbit insertion. We talked about that a little bit, but basically we're going up the hill and getting it to the point where we can get into orbit around L2. And that happened on day 24, 25 something. And that was the final insertion burn that occurred there to, again, put it into that orbit. And this is what it's going to look like over the years. It's going to be at that point right there at L2. So this is another version of that animation that I like so much. About a 6-month orbit around that point, that huge orbit around L2. And we're expecting, again, to fire the engines about every 3 to 4 months, about 3 to 4 times a year, I should say, to keep it in that orbit. The last slide I got on this is what happens next. So right now we're at that cooling period. It's going to be several months of commissioning. We'll start turning some of the cameras on, testing those 18 mirrors, start getting some coarse images back, continuing to align both the mirrors and some of these instruments. And notice that it's not going to be until close to 100 days after launch before this thing is at operating temperature, before it's brought down. It's got another 50, 75 degrees to go before it will be at the right operating temperature. Alignment's going to happen. We'll call it a line. The plan is at least have it by 120 days after launch, and then really start into that commissioning. So 180 days after launch is when those first operations are going to be able to begin. So somewhere in that green time frame, we might start seeing some images, but don't be surprised if it takes until the end of that period. So questions about that? I've got some time as well and a couple of slides to talk about why Arian was chosen, why the accuracy of Arian was necessary to put it into orbit, if y'all want that, or we can talk a little bit more about Webb or whatever. What kind of questions do we have, Doug?
Yeah,
Danny, you want to repeat that one?
I said I'd like to know why Arian Space was chosen over like SpaceX or some of the other carriers.
All right, so here's the short answer. Let me share again. Doink, doink.
While we're at it, I'll just read off one of the other questions.
Yes, sir.
Will the Webb telescope be able to detect signs of life on exoplanets?
Exoplanets are part of the proposed mission. Don't have a whole lot of information on how that works with the telescope's capabilities, but I'm assuming we're going to use that infrared capability to look a lot deeper at exoplanets from much farther away, and especially ones that are currently being blocked by things that are much closer to us. So I don't have a whole lot of information on that, but exoplanets are definitely part of the plan.
Great, good thought.
All right, so let me go into. Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, one more, and then we'll go on. This one said from Steve Blake says, I read that some of the instruments are so sensitive to the far infrared and they have their own limited supply of coolant to get really cold. Can you comment?
That's true. That's another limited resource there. Once that coolant is gone, we'll be able to continue to operate those instruments, but at a reduced capability, at a reduced sensitivity. It's all about cold. You know, when you think about why we're out at L2, it is all about cold. You got to get these things as cold as possible.
All right, good. That's all of them so
All
far.
right. Let me jump into this one. I know this one's going to come back to bite me at some point, but that's okay. And I don't mind this being out on the web. I will say up front that the sources that I list down in the lower right-hand corner are important. I recognize that I'm comparing apples to oranges here because the sources are out of date, and I'll explain why they're out of date. But this is kind of the business slide of a talk that I gave earlier today at Astronomy Days titled How to Pick the Right Rocket. And what I was hoping that people would think about when they're looking at this is an answer to the question of why Ariane 5 was chosen for this, why Atlas 5 is chosen in some other cases, why the Falcon is chosen in some other cases. And it really comes out of, let me tell a quick story about particularly one incident where a very well-meaning person who was a very big fan of SpaceX asked a question of a ULA engineer who had just finished giving a great presentation to the media about the Parker space probe and why the ULA Delta IV Heavy was selected to launch that mission. I mean, it really came down to the Delta IV Heavy was absolutely the only vehicle that could get the job done. The Parker space probe was a unique mission in that normally those heavy rockets are used to launch very big vehicles, very big spacecraft. A lot of reconnaissance satellites, very large reconnaissance satellites for the military and others are launched on those. And it needs that power to deal with that heavy mass on top. Parker Space Probe was like the size of a washing machine or a refrigerator, relatively small vehicle. So why the heck are we putting it on this massive heavy rocket? And why do we have an additional stage up there? Parker Space Probe needed to get into a certain orbit. Its purpose was to fly through the atmosphere of the sun. It's been doing that for the last several years. In order to do that, it needed the delta V, the change in velocity from the Delta IV Heavy that only it could provide. And it wasn't so much about speeding the vehicle up or speeding the spacecraft up. It actually was about slowing it down, because when they left Earth orbit, they were going away from the direction of travel of the Earth. So we're trying to peel off that speed that was just naturally provided by the Earth going around the sun. The only vehicle that was capable of providing that level of delta V change was the Delta IV. So I felt for this poor engineer that got more or less accosted by the SpaceX fan. Oh, why the heck didn't you launch on a Falcon Heavy? Well, you couldn't do the job. The thing I was trying to get across during the talk this morning with more of a general public audience was, yeah, SpaceX is cool. Yeah, we've got our own favorite rockets, but these things aren't interchangeable. Each one of them is good at a particular job. So what you see right here, it's coming from the Ariane 5 user manual, which is relatively up to date. It's coming from the Atlas V user guide, which is not quite so up to date, but they haven't sent any updates since then. And then it's coming from the Falcon guide, which I know for a fact has changed since then, but I've been unable to get any new numbers, any new data. They have removed this from their user guide. And what you're seeing here are the accuracies that are not guaranteed, but what each one of these are aiming for. So the customer that's buying launch services has an idea of what they can hope for. You know, every mission out there is going to have different needs here. You may be looking to not have so much accuracy on orbit insertion. You're more concerned about lower cost. Falcon may be a good choice for you there. If you're looking for high accuracy in low Earth orbit, Ariane 5 isn't going to do it for you because they're not really geared for low Earth orbit. The numbers you see here are for GTO, for geotransfer orbit. And again, we're talking apples to oranges. But you can see from the numbers, the accuracy on both inclination, and that's that tilt of the orbit around the Earth in relationship to the equator, as well as the perigee and the apogee. Ariane 5's got them beat because of, and I bragged on this a little bit at the beginning of our talk, because of the incredible accuracy that it was actually able to provide. My understanding is its order of magnitude is better than what you see on the screen for what Ariane 5 was aiming for. Again, that's either side of nominal. It was closer to that middle part of nominal, was able to extend that mission by the fact that it was able to. So could Falcon have lifted it? I don't know. I don't know if we could even fit that if there's a payload fairing that would fit it. That's another factor that you have to consider. By the numbers, yeah, it was able to handle the mass that was being thrown at it. ULA might have been able to handle that mass too, but Ariane 5 was the right choice here because of these accuracy numbers, because you could fit it in that payload fairing. And again, because the ESA was our partner here and was providing those launch services. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a flavor of why it was chosen, and that there's a lot more to picking these other than, you know, quite frankly, it's become a bit of a popularity contest with, you know, who's your favorite launch provider. But I think it's awesome. We've gotten to the point where we have so many launch providers and so many launch vehicles that we're able to pick and choose like this. And it's just going to get better as more of these commercial launch providers are coming online. Did I answer your question at
all? Yeah, so there was another question, and I think it was may have had a technical interruption, but you know, there's a question asking why was it launched from French Guiana? And if you can kind of just do a fast recap.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. So French Guiana is a great place to launch rockets because it's so close to the equator. It's a degree or two off. I'd have to look at what the coordinates are. But if you think about your globe and you think about the circles that are formed as you hold your hands around the globe, where is that circle the biggest? It's at the equator. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller as you go up. The worst place to launch a rocket from is the poles. The best place is the equator. That's why the launch facilities, Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, so on and so forth in Florida, are a pretty good place to launch a rocket from American soil. Up at the Mars facility in Wallops, Virginia, a little bit worse. You keep going north, up into Alaska, where some of the facilities are there. You're losing the free energy from that large circle, the natural energy from the Earth's rotation. The farther up you go, there's quite a bit less there, and it's at its maximum near the equator. So that's why the French have been launching from there for years and years and years. So Webb was packaged up, I believe it was in California at the time, and placed aboard a container ship and taken through the Panama Canal, and then docked there in, I'm not going to try and pronounce the name of the town, but they're in the northeastern part of South America, brought by truck and put atop the rocket and launched from there.
I think another easy way to think about it is you're getting this push from the rotation of the Earth, and it's going in one direction. So and that's why you'll never see a rocket launched from west to east, because that you're actually going against the rotation. It always goes, from from the west to the east, not the other way around. But yeah, so you're getting that extra push by the mere fact it's rotating.
It's the conservation of angular momentum. So we're literally conserving that angular momentum from the Earth to give us that extra push.
There you go. And if there's any sci-fi fans, especially classic sci-fi fans, Jules Verne knew this. Back in whenever The Earth to the Moon was written. If you go and you look at the first couple of chapters of that, you'll see that he describes in fairly good detail of where that launch site was. It's using an old geodesic system, so you have to convert it to today's longitude and latitude. But once you go through all that math, the launch site that he mentions is somewhere outside of Tampa.
He had a lot of other things. It was his brother-in-law was a mathematician, and they actually worked out all the math. And if you actually look at the size and the mass of the limb, that's exactly the size and mass that they calculated.
That is so cool.
So there's a lot of there's a lot of parallels to what you actually saw in the Kennedy space program, between Apollo and from his book. Sky and Telescope did an article on it a number of years ago about the similarities.
I'll have to look that one up. That's cool. More questions?
Yeah, there's just one question about your clock up in the background. I'm assuming that's an atomic clock.
You're close. It's GPS.
Yes. Okay.
So that was a build I did over the holidays to give me something fun to do and get out my soldering iron again. So it's a kit I bought over the internet from a gentleman in the UK, and it was fun to put together. It is absolutely accurate down to the that hundreds digit.
Very cool.
And it's coming off of a GPS signal. So when you plug it in, it takes a couple of minutes to sync up to the multiple satellites that it wants to see. But I've shot it with a high-speed camera, and it's for reals. It's actually counting the proper numbers, and those flashing colons indicate that it's got that sync. And like an idiot, I during the time change, I got up in the middle of the night to watch it change from daylight savings to EST. My next project with it is I think I'm just going to switch it over to UTC and just leave it on that. But yeah, everybody notices my clock. My my colleagues ask if I'm trying to emulate mission control in here, and maybe. I have a habit of looking at that more than I look at my watch now.
Yeah. Well, now you can see exactly how late someone is to a meeting.
I absolutely take note of that, myself included.
Very good. Had one other comment here. There was one rocket that launches retrograde. Okay, interesting. Israel's the Shavit. I did not know that.
And that's because they don't want to overfly disputed territory, if I remember right.
That would make sense, because that would send it over Syria and yeah.
So that's why you don't see them launch a whole lot from there, I would suspect. And while they do have a reasonably solid presence in space based on the size of the country, I'm pretty sure they avail themselves of other countries' launch services for that very reason. But they do have that capability of launching from there. But yeah, they have to launch against the Earth's rotation. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Huh.
Very good. Any other questions, folks? If you want to, feel free to unmute yourselves. And don't be shy. All right. So what, while we're waiting on any other questions, what is next for Tony Rice?
Fun. So the other thing that I like to work with, it's awesome working with the museum and astronomy days and things like that. But every week I am in contact with about 300 broadcast meteorologists around the country. And that's kind of my passion, is I want to get them the tools that they need to share this with their audiences. So it's a great resource that we can tap into, just to get people a little more interested in this kind of stuff. So do a lot of work with them. Most recently, I've been working with, there's a competitor to the Weather Channel that was started by Fox, called Fox Weather. And I don't think they're going to be distributed on any cable systems. They're looking to do it totally over the web and totally over smartphone apps. So I've visited with them quite a few times on a couple of different topics, several times on the Webb telescope. And again, same idea, just trying to get people up, looking up and having some appreciation for this kind of stuff. And there's always something cool that we can talk about there.
Exactly.
Yeah, beyond that, what's next? I don't know. Y'all tell me, what's coming up really cool that we need to make sure my Mets know about, and something that we can share with the WRAL viewers to get them outside looking up, especially things that are naked eye visible. I'm looking at the what's above the horizon planetary wise, and it's easiest to get people outside in the evenings. It's harder to get them out before sunrise.
Yep.
And it looks like we're kind of a dearth for a couple of months. What do you all think?
We're going to be kind of entering that period where nothing is we're going to be on the complete other side. All the planets are clustered on the other end. But I was just going to say, I mean, we've got is it
The
8-year
lunar
anniversary or 9-year anniversary? Oh, that's right, lunar eclipse coming
Don't
up.
forget about that lunar eclipse on May 15th.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah,
We'll be out
Those
at
are always
Park
fun.
for that. Yeah, it'll be great.
So how cloudy do you think it's going to be that night? That's usually what we end up with.
yeah.
May's a terrible time for that.
Well, isn't that what the meteorologist is supposed to tell us?
Exactly.
But I think historically, it's been 80 to 90% of the lunar eclipses are just a complete washout for us.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, luckily they're events with long tails, so there's time there. It's not like a solar eclipse and clouds where you've got a couple minute window at best there.
yeah. But I think just in general, we've got the I can't remember. I think it's the 10-year anniversary of the Curiosity landing is coming up in August. So
that's worthy.
I don't know if we'll have kind of Mars up in a suitable position to view, but that's always kind of a nice anniversary. And then obviously 2 more years from now, a little more than 2 years, we'll have the solar eclipse.
That coming up, and it's time to start thinking about that. I'll tell you, with 2017, I started bugging my buddies at RAL about it, and they're like, yeah, we'll get to it. You need to get on top of this. You need to start planning for this. If you're planning on putting crews and such out there, thankfully they listened, and they had crews all over everywhere. They had folks out at Klingman's Dome out in the Smokies, and we're able to see from the top of the Smokies 360 degrees around it. I just got some incredible views there. The other thing that I've found that my meteorologist friends absolutely love to get information on is fireballs. And that's because they get phone calls about it. And I started putting in my weekly emails a breakdown of all the fireballs that have been reported by 5 or more people to the AMS, the American Meteor Society, I think it is. And it always gets confusing with my meteorological friends because there's also a American Meteorological Society. But pulling in the data from AMS on any fairly widely reported fireballs, it really started to get across that this happens a lot. In any week, the list that I'm sending them has got at least a dozen, sometimes 20 or 30 fireballs that have been seen just in the past week. I try to do a little bit of math to tell them, of the ones that are there, which ones are probably visible from their location based on the parameters we pull from there, how high up it was, what the trajectory and all that is. And just about everybody on my list, there's 1, 2, or 3 per week that are probably visible somewhere in the sky. Sometimes very low on the horizon, of course. But there was a couple of weeks ago where we had 3 or 4 of them. They were visible just in like 2-3 days time.
Well, and it's funny, with more and more people getting these Ring cameras or things like that, you see more and more of these reports going on, and just where these things were rarely caught on, I'm gonna say film, not film obviously, but they're rarely recorded, and now you can just every few days you see them posted on social media. Just
and the same with dash cameras. Dashboard cameras have provided some really good visuals on it. I haven't seen one personally since I was driving back from the coast a couple of years ago. And I looked at it, went, okay, I know exactly what that is. Pulled off to the side of the road, went ahead and while it was fresh in my mind, and I had some had a compass with me, could report where it was, and sure enough, it was over the Outer Banks, and a good 20-30 people saw it. We had one out of the Outer Banks earlier this week, and the amazing thing is, it was physically coming in from the Atlantic Ocean, was physically, I believe, based on the numbers, coming like right over the North Carolina, Virginia state line. And there was only 3 reports, and they were all from like right around Corolla, Duck, Elizabeth City, that kind of area. Meanwhile, you've got this massive, it was 2-3 in the morning, granted, but you got this massive population up in the Tidewater area. No reports from there. No idea why. I guess it's probably because there weren't that many ring cameras pointed down that direction.
Yeah. Yep. Definitely. Very cool. I don't think we've got any other questions. So with that, I want to thank you for a incredibly engaging conversation. Loved the animations, and just really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to talk to us. Thank you.
Yes, I appreciate the invite always, and thank you to NASA and Lockheed for making those animations available and making my job so easy.
Awesome. Again,
Thanks, Tony.
thank you very much.